Hi there. Welcome to the Religious Education Leaving Cert Coursework Guidance. My name is Clare O'Brien Quinn, and I've been teaching religion for over 20 years in the UK, but also in Ireland. And so I'm happy to help you with your coursework journey today. So this is a masterclass, and you should have a set of notes, Religious Education Leaving Certificate Guidance 2025. So I'm just going to run through with you today the nature of the coursework and the nature of the Leaving Cert RE exam. So as you know, the Leaving Cert exam is split into 3 units. Your overall grade is marked out of 400 marks, and the only compulsory unit in the Leaving Cert RE course is Unit 1, and that is exploration of philosophy and mythology and contemporary culture and the search for meaning and values through the lens of modern and ancient societies. So for that particular unit, you're examined 4 questions available on the exam, and you have to answer 2. And that unit will win you 80 marks. Unit 2, you have a choice of 3 sections, section B, C, and D. So it'll depend on your school, what your teacher or you as a class have decided to study. In my particular context, in my school, we study world religions and moral decision making, which is also very philosophical as well. And all these different sections link really nicely back to the compulsory section A. And then finally, what I'm going to be working with you today is Unit 3. Now, Unit 3 does appear on the exam. But also Unit 3 forms the basis of the coursework investigation. So every year the Department of Education chooses 2 sections from Unit 3, and you are required to produce a coursework investigation on one of the titles that's published. Now every year, November, the Department of Education publishes 4 titles and you choose to do one. Now, your coursework is worth 20% of your final grade, which is quite significant. So it's really important that you spend a long time thinking about the coursework title that you want to pursue. It's really important that you choose one that really does pique your interest, because the marking scheme requires that you show high levels of personal engagement. So it's really important that you choose one of the sections that appeals to you. So this year, in 2025, the sections that have been chosen for coursework are Section E, Religion and Gender, and Section H, the Bible, Literature and Sacred Text. So, as we said at the start of this video, the coursework is a really important piece of work for you to spend time on. So I always see it as you going into the exam with insurance, that you've got 20% already in your back pocket, and it takes a little bit of pressure off you going into the exam, particularly if you find examinations quite stressful. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for you to build up your marks. The date of final submission is the 2nd of May in 2025, and this year is the first year that the Department of Education is asking students to produce the coursework online. So you're to type up the document, and in the past students had to write it. It was quite an onerous task. So I think that you guys are in a really good position this year, that you're able to plan it out and to type it up and to send it off. So here are the titles, as we've already covered, and there is a word count, okay? So you have a word limit of 1,500 words, okay? So seeing as there are 2 parts of the coursework, there's component A and there's component B, I always think it's wise to split that word count between the 2 sections, okay? So I just need to cover, before we go into the more fine details of preparing your coursework, really important stipulations. And that is, if you look at the notes here, the expectation is that you are to do your coursework independently, but also under the supervision of your teacher. So It's stipulated in the coursework booklet, which you have access to at the back of your notes attached to this video, that you must source and identify all the sources that you used. Otherwise, there's a danger of your work being considered plagiarism. So it's really important that whenever you are writing about the title that you're investigating, that you reference the sources that influenced your conclusions. So you can see here that in the coursework booklet, the Department of Education has also considered that AI software could be used. So they're not saying that you're not allowed to use AI. You may use AI, but if you do use AI, you must reference that. Otherwise, that will be seen or could be considered to be an example of plagiarism or copying, and that could be investigated. So it's really important that you produce your own work. Okay, so if you want any more details about the nature of the coursework and the stipulations, there's a link there to department circular. So moving on, I'm going to show you now the 4 published coursework titles. So first of all, we've got section E, which is religion and gender. So the first title is as follows: for centuries past, women have contributed to the development of religious traditions as spiritual thinkers and writers. Profile the relationship that one such woman had with the culture of her day and the questions raised by her insights/actions for the people today. So this is a really interesting title for those of you who are interested in gender studies and those of you who are interested in the role that women have played in shaping religious narratives. Oftentimes people might criticize the fact that many women have been overlooked. And so this is a really interesting title for students who are interested in gender studies. The second title in religion and gender is E2. And this is a study of the role that a person's gender played in how each of the following have been experienced in religion: empowerment/freedom, exclusion/oppression. Again, anyone who's interested in exploring more about personal stories of women or men who have felt that they've experienced exclusion or oppression because of their gender within their religious communities. Or you could also look at it from the perspective of a male thinker or somebody who's experienced freedom or empowerment because of their gender, and that could be from a female or male perspective too. So what's really important as well when you decide to choose your particular title, that you keep in mind always the language that's used in the coursework title, and you consistently refer back to it in your writing. So if you're interested in section H, the Bible, literature and sacred text, the first option there available for you is H1. Oral traditions have been preserved within the Gospels in the form of prayers, stories, preaching, etc. An examination of the evidence for this statement, referring to 2 examples of how oral traditions have been preserved in the Gospels and the relevance of each example to Christians today. So there's quite a few things that you need to unpack in there. You have to choose a particular oral tradition, perhaps a prayer or story or Jesus' preaching, and then you need to provide evidence about how these particular forms of oral tradition were preserved in the Gospels. And then you have to go on and demonstrate how either prayers or preaching or stories still bear significance and relevance for Christians today. And then finally, your final option there is H2, an investigation into how a canon of scripture emerged within either the Hebrew or Christian traditions, and the reason why a particular piece of literature was excluded from this canon. So this is quite interesting because it requires you to dig into the history of the formation of the canon. You can choose to examine either the Jewish which is the reference to the Hebrew tradition or the Christian tradition. And then you look at a particular piece of literature that was excluded, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, and then you have to investigate why this particular piece of literature was excluded. Okay, so once you have chosen your title, it's really important to examine what exactly you're required to do with that title. So as I said earlier, the coursework is split into two parts. So we've got part A, with this, which is worth 40 marks, and part B, also worth 40 marks. Now, part A is the part of the coursework that details your research, the summary of your findings, what you learned after investigating the particular title that you have chosen. Part B is your personal evaluation. So this is a reflection on your coursework journey. So it's an opportunity for you to use the personal tense. In Leaving Cert Religious Education, the personal tense isn't assessed. So what you're being assessed on in the exam is your knowledge and understanding of the course content. And so I always advise students not to use the personal tense, not to say in this essay, I learned about Aquinas or Aristotle, and I like this particular teaching or philosophy of Socrates. It's really important that you use the academic tense, and that you are showing and demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of these particular parts of the course without giving your personal opinion. However, with coursework in part B, you can and you ought to, you're required to give your personal response to your experience of this particular learning journey. So we're going to move on now to how to properly prepare for your coursework. So in this part of the notes here, you can see that I have the 4 titles listed, 1 to 4 there. And it's really important that you spend time ruminating, thinking, which one really speaks to me. And once you have decided on that, you have to go to your coursework booklet. On page 6 of your coursework booklet, and you are to type in the title that you have chosen exactly as it appears in the Department of Education circular. So this is a list of the 4 titles exactly as they appear in the Department of Education circular, and so that is your very first task. You win a mark for this. So as you go to the back of the notes, you'll see that I have included mark schemes. And one of the first marking criteria is that you have written exactly as it is published in the Department of Education circular, the title of your chosen coursework investigation. Okay, so I've taken a screenshot here in this part of the notes of the requirements for part A, so what you're expected to do. So my advice is that you break down your tasks into nice little small chunks that you're able to complete within the word limit allocated to you. So for part A, the advice is that you should spend no more than, or allocate no more than 750 words. So if your coursework word limit is 1,500 words, you should make it a priority to not go over that, because you could be penalized. So it's a good idea to split the word count evenly. So for part A, you should be spending 750 words, and then for part B, again, 750 words. So for this part of the coursework task, you are required to indicate the sources of information that you have used. They offer examples here, for example, web-based materials, literature, and other sources. So that's the first thing that you should do. So many students misunderstand this task, and they think that they're being required to write a bibliography. that is not the case. The bibliography comes at the very end of your coursework booklet, and it's on page 18. And there you're required to provide every source that you have used to help you produce this coursework. This part, however, that we're looking at here, asks you just to indicate briefly, give an overview, a summary of the materials that you used. So really what they're looking for is a narrative. Really what you're expected to produce here is a story of your coursework journey. So as I say here, it is not a bibliography where you list all your sources. That comes at the end. So you do have to produce a bibliography, but not till the very end of your coursework. Here, you're writing a short story identifying the sources that you use. So you just give a brief overview. And then I think it's a good idea to identify one or two sources that proved particularly useful to you. So I've got a 75 word max limit here because most of the 750 word limit should be allocated to the summary of your investigation. So I've got a prompt here, a few prompts that you could start off with. So throughout this coursework investigation, I've used a wide range of sources of information, including the Department of Education Leaving Certificate Religious Education syllabus and the course textbook. I've conducted an interview with, I visited many websites, such as I watched a documentary, or I read many academic books or journals, including. Now, the biggest problem that you're probably going to find is that your 75 words are swallowed up quite quickly. So the aim of the game here is to be succinct, okay? So I think another thing that is a good idea is to choose one particular book or documentary that really helped shape the coursework that you produced. So a standout piece of document, and that could just be a couple of sentences saying this particular piece of source material was really useful to me, this documentary was really useful to me, and explain why, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of the examples that I'm going to offer you to investigate in terms of the different coursework titles. So these are just suggestions, and you obviously don't need to follow this exactly. In fact, you shouldn't, because the coursework is supposed to be your own work. But I know that many students find it really hard identifying how to start off. So even if you have an idea, of a spiritual writer or a piece of literature that was not included in the canon, it can allow you to know where to begin. Okay, so I've got some examples. So let's say we're going to start off with E1, which is the first title from Religion and Gender. And that title, again, is For Centuries Past, Women have contributed to the development of religious traditions as spiritual thinkers and writers. A profile of the relationship of one such woman had with the culture of her day and the questions raised by her insights, actions for people. So there's many different examples that you can use. Some obvious ones that were discussed in my class were Teresa of Avila, and she was a Spanish Carmelite nun and mystic. And so this is also a really interesting subject choice because it links back nicely to section A. So in section A, there is a requirement for you to examine the different religious interpretations of human experience. And one of those interpretations, along with prophetic and aesthetic and the holy, is the mystic and the mystical. So Teresa of Avila is a mystic that you could reference in section A, but that you could also reference in this particular coursework piece, okay? So What you need to do then is you need to look at the action verbs. So, what are you required to do once you've chosen your particular subject? Well, you need to examine the relationship that she had with the culture of her day. So, with regards to Teresa of Avila, um, she was really important in establishing convents, and she reformed monasteries for women. So she's a feminine hero and a feminist hero. And so she is somebody who is seen as a powerhouse and somebody who challenged the patriarchal norms. And so that is a great example of a person who had a really profound impact on the culture of her day. So we're looking here at the 16th century, very patriarchal societies. So she was somebody who had a huge amount of courage and fortitude in, advocating for the important roles of women within her own religious tradition. Now, that's not the only thing that you're required to do. You're also required to examine the questions raised by her insights and actions. So, here, you could mention, if you want to do somebody like Teresa of Avila, how she challenged the gender roles within the church, and how she rose questions about gender equality and women's leadership in the church and in religious institutions. So it's really important that when you choose your coursework title, that you make it habitual, that you consistently link back to the learning verbs outlined in your coursework title and to the title itself. So I've got some examples of resources that you could use to supplement your investigation, and the ones that I've highlighted in yellow are the official Veritas textbooks that are associated with each of these sections in Unit 3. So Religion and Gender is the Veritas Leaving Cert book, and I think it's a good idea that you reference those, because within those particular textbooks they are examining the learning outcomes that are articulated in the Leaving Certificate RE syllabus. Another example of a spiritual thinker and writer, somebody who's quite popular in our context in our school, is Dorothy Day. And she was a co-founder of the Catholic worker movement. And she was also a pacifist and somebody who really emphasized social justice, which is a really important concept as well in section F, but also in section D. It's important that you identify the links that are obvious within your coursework titles to other parts of the curriculum that you have studied in school with your teacher. So you can see that the coursework titles tend to link back quite nicely to section A, but then you can see parallels also with section C and D and F. So it's a wise strategy to demonstrate an awareness of how there are parallels and crossovers within the coursework study and also the material for which you're going to be examined. So again, I've got some suggestions there. The Road to Character by David Brooks is a really good book that was published relatively recently and is a really enjoyable read. And he talks, in quite a poetic way about the contributions of Dorothy Day. So, in terms of your second coursework title, we have a study of the role that a person's gender played in how each of the following has been experienced in religion. So, empowerment/freedom, exclusion/oppression. It's important that you acknowledge both of these. So, I've got some examples here of good subjects that are relevant to this particular coursework title, but they're just examples. And it's also a really good idea that you do some investigation, that you do some research, and you find a person, a subject that really does have some kind of resonance to you, that you feel some kind of genuine personal engagement with. because if you do that, your coursework will be all that more enjoyable. So choose someone that you find fascinating. So we've got Joan of Arc here, but somebody who I know in our context really grabbed the attention of students was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a fascinating advocate of human rights and free speech and feminism. And she has written actually many books about her own experience of coming out of the Muslim religious tradition. She has a lot of really influential supporters and admirers, including the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, who I'm sure many of you know is quite an outspoken critic of religion, and he sees her as a champion of human rights and somebody who has great courage and fortitude in criticizing religious ideologies at a great personal cost to her own safety. So she is somebody who experienced incredible exclusion and oppression within her own religious tradition in Somalia, but also as a refugee and asylum seeker in the West. A lot of people criticized her for her very outspoken criticism of Islam. But it's really important that you must also zone in on not just one part of the coursework title requirements. You have so much material there on Ayaan Hirsi Ali to talk about exclusion and oppression, but you must also talk about how her gender played a role in allowing her or enabling her to feel empowerment and freedom. So for that you need to dig a little bit deeper. In fact, only recently there's some great podcasts, including Richard Dawkins' podcast Poetry of Reality, and he has written a letter on his Substack criticizing. He's a big advocate of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, but he was criticizing her recently for converting to Christianity. So she had described how Christianity was a religion that actually reappealed to her because she felt that it gave her the freedom that she had been searching for her whole life. So this is a really interesting example of a person who's able to really beautifully fulfill the requirements of the coursework there for the exclusion / oppression, but also for the empowerment and freedom. And then again, some suggestions there. Now you can see with the suggested resources, got the official Leaving Cert Religious Education Veritas textbook for Section E, but also some of her own written work, autobiography. And then I've also got some really good links there to articles written about her apostasy and about her criticizing Islam. But there's really interesting documentaries and there's really interesting interviews and debates that you can research on YouTube. So I'm not giving you all the material here, I'm giving you suggestions because it's really important that you really do make the effort to make this a personal journey and investigation and research piece. Okay, so there's just what I'm offering here are suggestions for how you just get off the starting block. So I'm going to do this for all the coursework titles, just give you some ideas that allow you to say, right, now I know this is my title. How am I going to start actually beginning the coursework investigation? So our third coursework title available for your investigation is Section H, which is the Bible literature and sacred text. So H1, oral traditions have been preserved within the Gospels in the form of prayers, stories, preaching, an examination of the evidence of this statement referring to two examples of how oral traditions have been preserved in the Gospels and the relevance of each example to Christians today. So an example that you could use is the Sermon on the Mount. This is a really important piece of moral guidance found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. also known as the Beatitudes, which appears in other sections of the course. So it appears in section D, for the ethical vision of Christianity. And it also appears in section F, Christian/religious visions of justice. But also, you can link this back to section A and concepts of God and images of God. And the Christian image of God here is a image of God that is loving, is compassionate, cares about those on the margins. So again, when you are determined to pursue one coursework title, try and find those obvious links to other parts of the course. It shows a really good understanding of the course content, and so it's an impressive way to show to the examiner you have really delved in deep into the coursework investigation, but you also can see the parallels elsewhere in the course content. So again, I've got some suggestions there. The official textbook again is highlighted in yellow, and this is the Veritas textbook, the Bible, Literature and Sacred Text. And again, as I said earlier with section E, it's a good idea to ask your teacher if you could peruse their copy, because these particular textbooks do cover the learning outcomes as directed by the syllabus. So again, some other examples there of books that you could get from your local library or maybe your school library that help you do some deep diving into that particular title. And then your final title is also from section H, the Bible, Literature and Sacred Text, and that is H2, an investigation into how a canon of scripture emerged within either the Hebrew or Christian traditions, and the reason why a particular piece of literature was excluded from this canon. So for this particular title, you need to choose. You need to choose whether you are going to examine the Hebrew slash Jewish traditions or the Christian traditions, and you have to state that when you are writing in your coursework title. So you can underline that in bold, for example, that this is the one that you're doing. So here I've got again some examples of particular texts that were excluded. So the Book of Enoch, for example, that was excluded from the Hebrew canon. And then with the Christian canon, one example that we used was the Gospel of Thomas. Okay, so I've got again the suggestions there for different sources that you can dig into, but they're just suggestions just to help you get off that starting block. But it's really important that this is a really personal investigation, and that you find sources maybe from, speaking to your librarian, going to the local library, or just a Google search of books that appeal to you, appeal to your interest, are really useful for your own particular coursework title. So we're going back now to part A. This is what the coursework booklet looks like. We can tick off the first task. So I allocated 75 words for that particular task. Remember, being succinct is the aim of the game here, and that's easier. It sounds easier than it is. It's actually a problem that many students have, is that they don't know how to cut down the amount of work that they're producing. So try to be succinct as best as you can. So I've highlighted here our next task. So here you're required to produce an outline of the steps that you took in putting together your coursework. And you're also required to identify the skills that you used or you developed as a result of investigating your chosen title. So again, you don't have a lot of words to cover this. So I have a suggestion here again for 75 words. So 75 for task 1, which is the indication of the sources of information you used, and 75 for the outline of the steps that you took, and that comes to 150. So that leaves you just 600 words for the summary of your findings. So it's really important that you try to be succinct and that you don't go over the word count because you don't want to be penalized. So this is our third task. So I have it written here as A3. So if A1 is writing down your course title and A2 is identifying the sources, then A3 is setting out the main steps that you took in putting this coursework together. You also have to identify the skills. So I've got some exemplars for starting off this part of your coursework investigation. So again, you're telling a story to the examiner. You're telling the story of your coursework journey. You're telling the examiner what you did in order to produce the document that they are marking in front of them there. Okay, so I've got an example here of how to begin. Don't copy this. Make sure that you use your own words, okay? And make sure that it's a personal response, all right? So just here's an example of how to start. I began my coursework investigation into, and then slot in your coursework title there. By identifying the learning verbs in the title, I began by examining closely what the demands of the question were. So here, what I've done is I've taken the learning verbs from each of those 4 titles and I put them in there. So for example, I understood from the title I needed to provide a profile of, or present a study of, or examine the evidence of and evaluate the relevance of, or present the findings of my investigation into. Okay, so what you're doing is you're linking back to the coursework title that you have chosen to investigate. It's always good to employ the language in the set question in the actual exam because that shows the examiner that you are on task. So you're fulfilling the brief. And it's the same with the coursework investigation title. Employ the language in the coursework title in your response. So let's say you're doing E2. You're going to say that I needed to provide a profile of a woman within a religious tradition and examine and analyze how this particular woman experienced both exclusion and oppression and freedom and empowerment within her religious tradition. And then you explain how you found all this information. So you continue explaining your coursework journey. So my example here to help you off is I visited my local library to collect sources on my chosen title. I then arranged an interview so for example, you could interview your chaplain if you have one in your school. You could interview your RE teacher. You could interview your history teacher if you know anybody who has links to the theology or philosophy department in a university. You could interview them, anyone who you think could provide useful information for your particular coursework investigation. So one of my own students interviewed a friend of his mother who is a film director, and she examined the life of a woman who experienced oppression in her particular religious tradition. So this shows really high levels of personal engagement. And again, it's something that can't be plagiarized. It's his own narrative, it's his own story, it's his own investigation and research. And that comes across very clear in the coursework that he produced. So you can tell. You can tell when a student has just, ticked the boxes and is just fulfilling the tasks because it's a task that needs to be fulfilled, as opposed to the students who've really dug deep and really tried to embrace this as a personal research project that they actually get a huge amount out of. And it comes across in the writing, and then it's also recognized in the marking. So that's my advice to you is really try and make this a personal journey into your coursework investigation, because that will come across in your writing. So once you identify how you produced this coursework piece, you then have to identify the skills that you were able to develop as a result of doing this coursework investigation. So my advice to you is to have a look at the Department of Education Senior Cycle Skills National Framework document. I've included it in this booklet because it's really useful for you to identify the skills that the Department of Education is hoping that you, as a Leaving Cert student, are able to, the skills you're able to curate as a result of engaging in the curricula. So you can see here that for the senior cycle, there are 5 key skills that you are able to develop as a result of engaging in the curriculum, and that is communicating, being personally effective, working with others, critical and creative thinking, and information processing. So I think it's a good idea to identify at least all 5 throughout your coursework document. And there's an opportunity if you're running out of words, your word limit is being swallowed up, there's an opportunity for you to refer back to those skills in part B. So I've included pages from that document in the following pages. So here is an explanation of the 5 different skills in more detail. So, for example, if we look into the information processing skill, this skill helps learners to become competent in an information intensive environment. And you're working in an information intensive environment. You have AI at your fingertips. There is a serious problem today with misinformation and disinformation. And so you really need to apply and develop your critical thinking skills to ensure that the information that you're getting is credible, the sources are credible, and you need to be able to demonstrate that in this coursework investigation, that you're able to develop an ability to have a robust understanding of how to distinguish and differentiate between quality information and poor quality, unreliable information. So, in terms of being personally effective, I think coursework is a task that you engage in that really does demand being personally effective. You have to, because of coursework, demonstrate independence. You can't be spoon fed. You have to rely on yourself, and you have to be personally effective when it comes to your time. You have a deadline. The deadline is coming up. It's the 2nd of May, but it's important that you allocate time out of your busy academic schedules to ensure that your coursework is a H1 quality piece of work. And so you have to be conscientious, you have to be diligent, you have to stay on top of your deadlines. And so that is a difficult thing to do as well when you're so busy in other parts of your academic and co-curricular lives, and especially when you have to do it yourself. So this part of the coursework requires you to reflect on those skills that you were able to develop and then articulate that clearly in your coursework investigation. So again, these are examples of ways in which you're able to demonstrate that you developed these skills. So, for example, being personally effective, being able to appraise oneself, evaluate your performance, receive and respond to feedback. So, in terms of being personally effective here, that would include going to your teacher, asking for feedback, asking for guidance, and then working on that, responding to that, and then building up your repertoire in terms of your writing, your source material, your referencing, whatever that may be. So it's the ability to be a reflective learner comes into that skill too. So what I've got here are the specific things that you should be able to do as a result of developing these skills, I think that it is always wise that you choose some of these particular learning outcomes and then weave it into your coursework investigation. Okay, so in terms of, let's say, the key skill of critical and creative thinking, there's a learning outcome here, the very first bullet point here, to understand the difference between opinion and reason, judgment and fact. That is one of the requirements in terms of the marking scheme for Part B. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're aware of a variety of different perspectives. So in this part of Part B, you'll be able to demonstrate that you were able to develop this skill because you can distinguish between different scholars having different views on your particular subject, okay? And that you're able to determine that sometimes these views are in conflict, okay? And then how you square that with your interpretation of the truth, okay? So my suggestion is that you go through these 5 different skills and take out at least one learning outcome for each of those, and then embed that into your coursework investigation to demonstrate that you developed these skills. Okay, so after that, this is the meatiest part of the coursework. You are allocated now 600 words to present a summary of your findings from your examination of the title that you chose. So what I've got here for each of the different coursework titles are the syllabus topics that these coursework titles derive from. And then I've got the learning outcomes that you're expected to explore. So it's really important that you make some kind of reference to this learning outcome in your coursework investigation. So for example, if we're looking at E1, for centuries past, women have contributed to the development of the religious traditions as spiritual thinkers and writers, a profile of the relationship that one such woman had with the culture of her day, and the questions raised by her insights, actions for people today. You need to be able to make some kind of reference to those learning outcomes. So you need to be able to identify an understanding. You need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the different gender roles that are established within the religious tradition that you are examining, okay? And then by doing that, what you're showing the examiner is that you have a clear understanding of the learning outcomes in that part of the syllabus, okay? So it's really important that you're showing the examiner you have this kind of breadth and depth of awareness of how the coursework title is relevant to the course content, okay? So what do you need to do? For this part of the coursework, you are producing your investigation, a summary of your investigation. So it's wise that you have a notebook, that you detail all the information that you glean from your reading, from your listening to podcasts, from your watching documentaries, and then you keep a database of all those sources alongside with all the information that you got, and you make sure that you reference where you're getting this information from. So the marking scheme requires that you show substantial referencing skills. So for example, if you are doing a coursework title examining empowerment or oppression of a person in a religious tradition, and let's say you've chosen to examine someone like Ali Hirsi Ali, and you are detailing her experience of Islam in Somalia, you must then always reference where this material came from. So you bracket, and you might bracket her book Infidel. So it's really important that that is consistently done throughout your coursework, because if it's not, that's going to raise alarms. Where is all this information coming from? So this is your opportunity to demonstrate that you are able to provide evidence for where you've got your information from. So referencing is key in this particular part of the coursework. So we want to see lots of brackets and lots of references and books, okay, and documentaries. So reference your sources, as I've said here, throughout your summary. It's really important that you do that. So how you do that is you bracket a source used. So for example, if you were referencing the wonderful work of Ryan Holiday, you would put Holiday 2021, or the full reference would be the Dave Stoke Ryan Holiday 2021 is the first time it would appear in your summary. And then after that, you just have to do Holiday 21 to shorten it down, okay? Now, you'd also then have to reference that full reference in the bibliography at the end of your coursework. So how do you start off? I've got some example prompts here just to help you just start off your coursework summary. Now, again, it's really important that you're using your own words. These are just examples for you to help you start. So let's say you're doing E1. Throughout my research on E1, I learned about the fascinating history of the life of X. That's your subject. My key findings are as follows. And here, try and keep to, really, not try, do. You have to keep to the word limit. Because, as I said, this is the first time that your coursework is being examined online. And so in the past, students were able, I'm sure, to go above the word count because they were writing their documents. It's not so easy to expect examiners to count up the words when it's in written form, but when it is in typed form, quite easy to do a word count. But also there's a stipulation that you type in the number of words at the very start of your coursework booklet. You have to identify the amount of words that you use. Really, you should be writing 1,500, no more, no less. So, use all the words allocated to you. You'll find that your problem, really, the biggest problem that you encounter is having more words than less. It might not seem that if you're just starting that now, it might seem daunting, but once you get into it, you'll realize those words are swallowed up quite quickly. Again, E2. Through my research on E2, I learned about how the life of X was shaped by their experience of, and then putting the religious tradition that their subject belonged to, and how this led to feelings of both empowerment and exclusion. My key findings are as follows. Okay, penultimately, throughout my research on H1, I learned about, and then insert 2 examples of how oral traditions were preserved in the Gospels. It could be prayers, it could be stories, it could be preaching, and how these still have relevance for Christians today. My key findings are as follows. And then finally, through my research on H2, I uncovered the intricate and compelling history behind the formation of the Bible, or the Torah. My key findings are as follows. Now, that's part A done. So that is in total 750 words. Okay, so you now have half of your coursework done. Okay, so the second part of coursework is part B, and again you have 750 words max. Okay, so this part, as I said before, this is quite a nice part of your coursework because it's the reflection. You are reflecting on your learning journey. You're here being given an opportunity to use the personal voice to tell your own experience of how your coursework investigation went, what you learned from it, what you enjoyed, what was a struggle, what insights you gained, what proved to be questions that remain unanswered, that actually might continue to allow you to travel this particular learning journey. So you have 5 questions in part B that you're required to respond to. So for each of these questions, I'm allocating you 150 words, okay? And then that adds up obviously to your 750 word max. So the first question that you're expected to require to, I have written down in B1, so task 1 in part B. So for this first task, you're asked to state the reason why you personally chose the title from the prescribed list for coursework. So here you have an opportunity to show personal engagement. Why were you interested? We learn a little thing. We learn, and the examiner learns a little something about you, who you are, what your interests are, and that's a rare opportunity in this particular subject. As I said, this is a content-based course that you're assessed on your knowledge and understanding of the course material, and also assessed on your ability to respond with flexibility in your application of that material to the particular question that's assessed in the exam. There's no room for your personal views. There's no room for your personal insights, but now there is. So I know students sometimes struggle with that. They want to give their opinion. Classes in RE, I love this subject. Obviously, I'm biased. I think it's the best subject ever, but I love it so much because it is a subject that allows you to really get to the soul of the person sitting in front of you in the class. You get to understand their values, their context, their stories, and how that shapes their worldview, their opinions, their beliefs about a plethora of really important, relevant issues, which is why we always say RE is so relevant. So it's so nice to have the opportunity in part B to see that aspect of the student, to see the person behind the information that was produced. So take advantage of that. So you also really need to, because it's part and parcel of the marking criteria. So you are required to show substantial personal engagement. So we really need to see what was it about the particular title that grabbed you as an individual. So here you are required to show personal interest and an explanation for why you chose your particular title. So one way to do that is to link it to a personal story. As I said before, I have a student who chose E2 because he knew someone who was a film director who produced a really interesting documentary, and so that was a really interesting personal insight when marking that particular piece of coursework. You learn a little bit more about the person and their context and how that shapes their interests. So I've got some examples here of how to start. Again, we have to emphasize to use your own words and your own language. But let's say we're doing E1, you could start off by saying, I chose to investigate the life of a female spiritual writer for my coursework because women's contributions to spirituality and theology have often been overlooked. Exploring the life of a female spiritual writer allowed me to highlight their influence and impact. But what's missing there that you need to develop is why that grabs you. Why are you interested in gender issues? Do you feel that there is a way that you could link that back to your own personal story, for example? So this is what makes your coursework stand apart from all the other candidates producing coursework. And this is your opportunity as well to show that this is your own personal, genuine work, that you haven't taken it off AI. This is your story. You could choose, for example, to look at section H. I chose to investigate how the oral traditions were preserved because perhaps you might want to say that you have a strong conviction and that prayers and stories found in the gospel have really shaped your moral worldview, helped you through difficult times. So this is the part of the coursework where you let us, the examiner, see the person and the story, the personal story behind the coursework. Okay, so that's a really nice part of the coursework. I liked to mark part B, especially because you really get to see the personality behind the summary, which is factual and obviously always really interesting to read, particularly if it's researched well and a really interesting subject has been chosen. But part B shows, as I said, the human behind the hard work that was produced. So let's look at B2. For B2, you're expected to identify different perspectives you encountered. So here again, you're able to demonstrate your critical thinking skills, and you're able to demonstrate how you're aware that there are different perspectives that exist in the academic scholarly world, and you're able to recognize nuance and different opinions, and as a result of examining these different perspectives, come to your own reasoned conclusions. So let's say, for example, you had chosen to examine the life of Malala in the coursework title E2. What's really important is that you examine how different scholars perceive your subject's experience, lived experience, and then they're relaying off that lived experience. So let's say we're doing Malala. So Malala's interpretation of Islam, particularly her advocacy for women's education and rights within an Islamic framework, has been the subject of various scholarly interpretations and perspectives. So here you outline two different perspectives. So you might say, A, choose a scholar who supported Malala's interpretation and outlined reasons why that scholar is an advocate of Malala's work. But then you have to say, on the other hand, that's not the case across the Islamic scholarly world. And you identify a scholar who disagrees with her interpretation and within her Western liberal context as an affront against traditional Islamic teachings, particularly where Sharia law is practiced in the Middle East. So that's really interesting to, do a deep dive into different scholarly views on the particular coursework title that you are investigating. Okay, so for part B, moving on, you are then required to identify the questions that arose for you through doing coursework on the title chosen from the prescribed list. So here you really need to do some reflection on some of the questions that perhaps remain unanswered for you, or questions that really took you in a different direction. So let's say you had chosen to examine title E2. You could include questions such as how societies balance the right to freedom of religion with the need to protect individuals from harmful practices justified by religious beliefs. There's a lot to unpack there, and you're not required at all to unpack these questions in section, but you don't have the word limit that allows you to do that. But it's just an opportunity for you to show an awareness of some of the more complex questions that need further attention, perhaps urgent attention, as a result of you doing this coursework. So really, it's an opportunity for you to show the examiner that you have been taken in a different direction than you initially thought, and that this journey is not over. This coursework journey is not over, that there's still questions that you're going to continue to investigate as a result of doing this. So it's about really being a lifelong learner. So you have to show in a succinct manner how this coursework has allowed you to become a questioning, curious person. Okay, so Again, you could ask the question, what are the implications of religious exclusion for freedom of expression, especially for those who criticize or seek to reform their own religious traditions? Again, quite a meaty question and very topical and very relevant, particularly in today's zeitgeist and today's particular climate. You could even reference here the presidency of Donald Trump and his association with Elon Musk and as they see themselves. Obviously, this could be questioned and challenged. They see themselves as champions of freedom of speech and uh, even at a cost to people's sensitivities and cultural sensitivities. There again is a question there that could lead into a whole new piece of coursework that demands a huge amount of attention, a huge amount of attention to detail that you don't have the time to do in this particular section of B, but that you're showing an awareness of it, that there's so much left still to unpack. Okay, so for part B, task number 4, you're then required to describe the personal insights that you gained through doing coursework. And so here, I've got a list of questions that you can respond to. So what did you learn about yourself while doing coursework? Did you learn that you were diligent and conscientious? Did you learn that you really enjoyed doing independent study? Did you enjoy reading academic journals over listening to podcasts? Are you more a visual learner? You like watching documentaries as opposed to a learner who avoids having to read heavy scholarly texts? So what kind of personal insights did you get? So something that reveals a little bit about your character. Okay, so what did you learn about yourself that you didn't know before? Are you a procrastinator? Do you find it hard to do these coursework pieces because you prefer working in the context of the classroom and doing class tests as opposed to having to take on the responsibility of doing a 1,500 word coursework investigation on your own? Do you prefer group work? Things like that. You also need to tell us something with personal insight, but also an academic insight. Did you learn something about a particular religious tradition that you hadn't learned before? So you could also project into the future. Is there something that you learned from doing this coursework that is going to influence your future studies? So is there a potential for you pursuing philosophy or history or world religions because you enjoyed learning about a particular religious tradition so much? Okay, so there's a list of questions there. You have 150 word limit here, so just choose 2 to 4 that you respond to that actually show an awareness of insights that you gained. So how would you start this particular response? So I've given you an example prompt here. Remember, you don't have much words to work with. This learning experience affected my ideas by encouraging me to question assumptions, appreciate the diversity of perspectives within religious traditions. It also influenced my attitude by fostering a greater sense of open-mindedness and respect for different viewpoints, something that's in short supply nowadays. You could reference that today, how, the world become more polarized. And so by doing coursework, it really allowed you to see the benefits of recognizing diversity of views, identifying nuance, etc. And that's something that's needed in today's educational landscape. So make your personal insights relevant to the context in which you find yourself today. One more thing that you have to do, well, actually, 2 more things if you include the bibliography. And this is where you relay to the examiner what was the most valuable thing about doing coursework. So here, as I said before, you can go back to the skill that you developed. You really appreciate the opportunity to coursework because it developed your critical thinking skills, or it developed your ability to be personally effective. It developed your communication skills, writing skills, and so I would wax lyrical. I always say give the people what they want. I think that if you tell the examiner that it was a really rewarding experience, I think that will read well. I don't think it's wise to use this as an opportunity to say how much you hated the coursework and it was really arduous and laborious and boring. I think that it's good to try and see what was really beneficial. What did you get from it? Why was it enjoyable? And it just reads in a really positive way. And it also demonstrates that, this coursework that's, being included in subjects going forward from September onwards is a good idea. That coursework is beneficial for the students who participate and engage in it. So again, I've got an example prompt. So the most valuable part of doing coursework has been the experience of engaging with the Religious Education Leaving Cert course in a deeper way. Some of the students actually talk about that Unit 3 were only able to study one of those sections for the exam, and it just seems like there's not enough time to delve in deep into other sections. Well, there's no time. There's no opportunity to delve into the other sections, and so at least the coursework allows students to have more of a choice in terms of the curriculum that's available. And so, for some students, they've really enjoyed that opportunity to look at section H and look at section E. So the very final thing, we're nearly there, guys. The very final thing that you're required to do is to produce a bibliography. And what you really should be doing here is including at least 10 sources. And that includes books, scholarly journals, newspaper articles. So you'd include the links to those newspaper articles. For the website, you'd use the full URL. For the books, you would use the like I've done here, a consistent referencing style. So you would have the title of the book, you would have the author, and then you would have you'd have the title, the year it was published, and then the name of the author. So you would have that consistent referencing style throughout your bibliography. And so, as I said, it's really important that you include all of the sources, even if you don't reference them in your summary in the brackets, when you're referencing where you got your information from, when you're producing that 600 word summary of your coursework investigation, anything that you used should go in here. Okay, so I think that it's also a really good idea that you use a variety of different sources. So not just books, but also websites, also academic journals, also documentaries. So I've got here for your bibliography, again, some suggestions of some of these are just books that I'm offering, some of the books that you could include in your bibliography, but this is only a very short list, so make sure that you have got 15 and that you've included a variety of different sources too, so documentaries and podcasts also. So just to let you know, what is also here to help you in your notes is there's a detailed marking scheme. So this is identifying what you're expected to demonstrate, to show in your coursework investigation in order to get the marks. Here is an annotation, explanation of the online marking system. So for many of you, this does say 2014 because obviously the 2015 marking scheme hasn't been published because the exam hasn't been sat. So they're the same every year. So This is really important for you if you intend to request to see your paper. I always think it's a good idea to request to see your paper, particularly if you're really successful in your Leaving Cert exam. I think that it's really good for you to see and to pass it on to your teacher, so your teacher has a record of outstanding work. So I think also it's a good way to kind of match the grade that you achieved from your teacher in comparison to what you got in the final grade, to see if there's a big discrepancy there and to kind of investigate why. So here's a breakdown of the marking criteria for section A and for section B. So you can see very detailed information what you need to do in order to get that excellent grade. So again, in part A, we need full, substantial, accurate evidence. And in terms of part B as well, we need full, substantial, accurate evidence. And in order to demonstrate that you've done this, always to provide references for where you got your information from. So at the very end of the notes that you have been provided with is the coursework booklet. And again, it's a really good idea that you spend time reading this in detail. So you'll have to put in your examination number on the front page and then your date of birth. Here's some information about the expectations. Again, that this is your own work and that you have not plagiarized, you have not copied, and that the expectation is that you reference all the sources that you've used. Guidance here as well on the size of the text, Arial font size 12, and you can't change that. Okay, so it's very prescriptive in terms of how you're allowed to input that information. So the coursework booklet is 18 pages, and there again is the details of how the tasks are separated in part A and part B, worth 40 marks each. Okay, now I've got the coursework booklet at the end here, and I've highlighted where you're expected to input your information. So remember, you get a mark for inputting your coursework title exactly as it is published. So that's your first task. And then at the very end, you're going to input the word count of your document. That should be reading for everyone 1500. Okay, so your coursework booklet there is at the end. You've got your bibliography on page 18. So everything that you need is here for you in these notes. Now, if you need any more help or any more guidance, remember that you can send me messages in the chat and I am more than happy to respond to any queries that you have. So best of luck. It was lovely to have an opportunity to help you with your coursework journey today, and hopefully see you again. Good luck, everyone.